this video, I would like to talk about genius and what it is. After all, this term is thrown around a lot, and it has been throughout a large part of modern history. It yet remains as ambiguous as it always was. Whether accredited to the pagan gods, the Judeo-Christian god, Allah, or simply, in plain Darwinian reasoning, to the superiority of genes, when we experience it, we know it immediately as something deserving of our fullest attention and respect. But can we understand it in pure rational terms? Can I define genius just like I can, for instance, define a particular species of animal or a carrot cake as opposed to an apple turnover? Is the idea of genius truly incomprehensible? I can't promise to answer all questions in this video, but I will start where all investigations should, following the leads already paved by those that came before us. We begin in ancient Greece, where Plato sets the scene of a fictional conversation between Socrates and Ion, Ion being the name of his work. Talking to Ion about what it is that makes one capable of discerning good art as opposed to bad art, using Homer as an example, Socrates says, "For the poet is an ethereal and winged and holy creature, but before that time they are unable to create until they are inspired and are out of their mind and are no longer in possession of their self-intellect." Only a few sentences further, Socrates says that these beautiful poems are not of humankind nor of human beings, but are divine and the gods, and thus the poets are nothing else than the messengers of the gods. Plato draws heavily on this idea that to create a work of art one must be out of their mind. By this, Plato does not mean that the artist is clinically insane, but that instead they are momentarily giving vent to the ideas and powers of the gods, their own talent and skills used as an instrument and not the creator. He even goes on to say that otherwise it wouldn't be the case that the creators of on average mediocre or outright poor work would suddenly create something undeniably special and holy, not unless they were, in that moment, possessed by the gods. Aristotle, more pragmatically, demystified the whole ordeal and pointed towards the innate potential in us all, nourishing our intellect and achieving something like genius through a strong and virtuous mind. But all of this is still a far cry away from the idea of genius later developed. Indeed, the word genius wasn't even used in any of the works cited so far, and it certainly wouldn't have been attributed to a person, but rather to the gods. An idea which would not change much for thousands of years after the birth of Judaism, Christianity, or Islam. To see where a shift takes place, we have to go to the end of the Middle Ages and the birth of the Renaissance. Here, our knowledge and ideas aren't only meant to return to those of classical antiquity, but are meant to outright transcend them. This transition is best made clear through the writings of the Italian painter and architect Giorgio Vasari. Here, he posits the view of genius being a more exclusive and individual possession, rather than a potential or possession granted to some of the time by gods or God. A trait or sublime gift residing in the hearts of very few. In his magnum opus, Lives of the Most Eminent Painters, Sculptors, and Architects, published in the mid-16th century, we can trace back the first instance of genius being actively perceived as something uniquely granted to some, rather than possible of cultivation by all. In the second edition, Vasari covers a staggering number of 160 artists over 3 centuries. It would not be controversial at all to say that this man of the Renaissance had produced the first, or at least the most important, work of modern historiography. In the introduction, he outlines the differing speculations of where art owes its origin. Was it to ancient Egypt, Rome, Greece, or Tuscany? The author concludes that the birthplace of architecture or painting is not really necessary. That in spite the obvious fact that it cannot be known since the first works of art would have certainly fallen buried under the sands of time anyway, we can surely be certain of one thing and one thing only. One way or another, art must have started with the work of God. And I don't even mean it in a religious sense, just that the creation of earth and the first man contained the impetus for design and art in themselves. After all, man was the very inspiration for the impeccable statues later chiseled by the ancient Egyptians and Greeks, and basically all other civilizations before and after. The fusion of God, the unique gift of genius, and man is best embodied in the following quotation: that these men, I say, having nature for their guide, and the unsullied purity of their fresh intelligence for their master, with the beautiful model of the world for an exemplar, should have given birth to these most noble arts, and from a small beginning, ameliorating them by slow degrees, should have conducted them finally to perfection. With the development of science, and especially eugenics, being very popular, it is only natural that the causation of genius would become more closely sought after in the very genes and biological makeup of a person. This transition was best embodied by a work published in 1869 by the English anthropologist Francis Galton. In The Hereditary Genius, he writes, "I am sure that no one who has had the privilege of mixing in the society of the abler men of any great capital, or who is acquainted with the biographies of the heroes of history, can doubt the existence of grand human animals, of natures preeminently noble, of individuals born to be kings of men." Galton, his worldview inspired by Darwin, who was actually his half-cousin, receives much criticism today, and understandably so, because if eugenics, a term he himself coined, would be indisputably true and should influence our rights and actions, then it is clear that this would lead to a lot of problems and abuses of civil rights, examples of which history gives us in abundance, for instance, the Nazis. However, that good health and abilities can be passed down genetically is not an idea that most would be ready to outright reject, and indeed, the very term, nature versus nurture, was actually coined by Galton himself. His theory does in the end fail, as there are so many geniuses who came from the most ordinary and unspectacular men, and despite the apparent genes they inherited, went on to achieve feats still looked upon with awe today. Think of Beethoven, Van Gogh. But if genius does not originate in our genes, nor our upbringing, then were the thinkers before us closer to the truth? Is it God and nothing else? Before we move on from Galton, I think it is very curious that he was the first to accurately draw the connection between madness and genius, a belief so popularized in the years to come that it culminates in the image of the starving artist. Here too would be inaccurate to make this the basis of all diagnoses for genius, as we cannot possibly think that all that have gone mad are actually geniuses. All these little truths which careful observation brings us, that it is possible of cultivation by all, that it is holy and rare and granted by the gods, that we are simply the messengers of the gods, or that there is some correlation between genes or madness and genius. All these ideas, all fascinating, contradictory, and compelling in different ways, cannot yet be a flawless definition of genius. Frustratingly and hopelessly, we seem to be no closer to understanding this phenomenon. It seems so evasive that this very fact itself supports its very divine status. If we cannot surely say what makes a genius, then perhaps we can at least talk about what makes the work of a genius truly different from that of others. Unless we fall into the cynical idea that all works of apparent genius are, on the contrary, merely imitations or pretensions, then no case for genius can ever be made. But if we concede, at least for this video, that it does exist, then we can at least see that not everyone uses it to create a work of pure genius, leaving a few that do. Before we go any further, it may be useful to first define beauty, for reasons which will be clear later on. We cannot talk about beauty and aesthetics without talking about Immanuel Kant. A frightening name in philosophy, perhaps only second to Hegel, Immanuel Kant was an Austrian philosopher of the Enlightenment age, born and buried in Königsberg, a place he never left during his lifetime. Kant believed that for something to be seen as beautiful, there may be no any basis for its determining grounds. In other words, I don't think a flower is beautiful because of its biological makeup or function, i.e. feeds bees with nectar and pollen. Indeed, I may as a toddler not even be aware of this and yet still perceive its inherent beauty. This is because it immediately pleases by engaging my imagination into a kind of free play with the senses and the intellect, encouraging creativity and reason. But also because it is evident at once that there is some kind of purpose or design behind its existence, though what that may be cannot ever be a qualification for its beauty. This seemingly paradoxical phenomenon and qualification is what Kant refers to as purposiveness without a purpose. For example, if I see a mountain of banknotes and call it beautiful, I would be misusing the concept of beauty, as I am merely referring to all the luxuries that such wealth, represented by the banknotes, could buy me, and thus the money is only a means to an end and not an end in itself, which all beauty must be. What beauty immediately inspires in us is the demand upon everyone else to also see it so, as we cannot imagine anyone else seeing it otherwise. And when we are confronted with such a prospect as when one says our favorite piece of art is okay or outright bad, we are at once roused into frustration and rush to defend our taste. Of course, we may use technical reasons to defend why this or that object is superior, such as its function, height, content, or appearance, but that cannot really be the basis for its beauty, because if that was the case, then it would mean that all imitation is equally as beautiful as the original creation, which is clearly not the case. If there are rules and formulations by which beauty can be created, then everyone would be capable of creating it. Where beauty is spoken of, it is not long before its more elevated cousin is brought into the equation, the sublime. Cassius Longinus, the Greek philosopher, is perhaps best known for his 1st century AD treatise on the sublime. In it, Longinus states, "A lofty passage does not convince the reason of the reader, but takes him out of himself. That which is admirable ever confounds our judgment and eclipses that which is merely reasonable or agreeable. To believe or not is usually in our own power, but the sublime, acting with an imperious and irresistible force, sways every reader whether he will or not." Further, Longinus outlines how upon reading a work truly sublime, the reader's immediate exultation and pride at the written word won't merely fade away, but will be experienced time and time again whenever he returns to the work, each revisit as novel as the first encounter. In a word, what Longinus is telling us is that the experience of the sublime is universal and not merely accidental to some people, and that not every work is worthy of this exaltation. And I think there are reasons in nature why the obscure idea, when properly conveyed, should be more affecting than the clear. It is our ignorance of things that causes all our admiration and chiefly excites our passions, states Edmund Burke in his 1757 work, A Philosophical Inquiry into the Origin of Our Ideas of the Sublime and Beautiful. In this passage, Burke tackles the idea that it is precisely that which we little understand that only increases our admiration for it. From this he draws that for something to be truly sublime, it must be little grasped, for only then it is truly terrifying. Terror and obscurity being the foundational elements of the sublime, at least in Burke's opinion. One here cannot help but be reminded of the great 20th century writer of horror, H.P. Lovecraft, when he said that the oldest and strongest emotion of mankind is fear, and the oldest and strongest kind of fear is the fear of the unknown. Indeed, to call the monstrous creations of H.P. Lovecraft sublime would not be at all inaccurate. Recall Cthulhu or Dagon, or the moon-resembling eye Groth, which wanders covertly through the infinite bounds of space, causing destruction to nearby planets. All of his creations are colossal, timeless, possess obscure lore, and take Cthulhu, who has a dozen names by which he is referred. All this makes it all the harder to visualize his creations, all of which suffer the moment they are drawn or shown on film. It is not for nothing that H.P. Lovecraft is called the father of cosmic horror. It should therefore come as no surprise when Edmund Burke reflects that the sublime often consists of the following elements: infinity, terror, obscurity, power, and vastness. I do not think it is necessary for something to be beautiful for it to be a work of genius, but I do think it must be sublime, or as Kant was careful to clarify, must represent the sublime. When you listen to a piece of music, read a passage, or watch a film and later exclaim how it was a masterpiece and an elevating experience, you do so because it evokes in you passions so strong you could only describe them as intense reverence, astonishment, fear, joy, or even confusion, all taking place during the exalted experience. Isn't this the result of a work of genius? Think of Mozart's concertos, Tolstoy's War and Peace, or the paintings of Da Vinci. Don't they deserve the status of genius because they invoke the sublime? If so, then genius is really the natural disposition to inspire in us nature's sublimity in the domains of art. This could be said of any genius artist, but what about a scientific genius like Newton, or a philosopher like Nietzsche? Well, talking about philosophers, and one definitely worthy of the status would be Arthur Schopenhauer, who wrote, "Talent achieves what others cannot achieve, whereas genius achieves what others cannot imagine." But this does not contradict a scientific breakthrough or a shattering proposition like Nietzsche's eternal reoccurrence or slave morality. All these could invoke confusion, vastness, even terror, and upon further assimilation, it only adds to our delight and understanding. In other words, it is sublime. Maybe here the reader quietly wonders, with hope or despair, am I a genius? I think to ask this question is to miss the point. So much of what makes genius genius is the natural propensity for a given craft or field, talent, the refinement of skill, and then perhaps most importantly the reception that nothing, like we said already, can be said to be genius before it is made or experienced, as there's no formula, no secret recipe, no easy answer. In the end, it will be the subjective and yet universal experience of those breathing in a piece of art that will involuntarily sign the verdict. How many artists receive due credit after their death? Maybe, just as genius is experienced without any ulterior motive, so too should the creator not be occupied with interests for gains, approval, or fame. But even if they do, it's all left to fate anyway. Our understanding of genius remains as little, if not smaller, than when we started, and yet this elevates it even more so. Wouldn't genius, the moment it be unequivocally defined, diagnosed and formulated by these very criteria, lose all its sublimity and thus cease being genius? Perhaps all that is left to do is for us to see it and never stop admiring it. The burden of appreciating genius is not on the genius themselves, but on us all. That's why Van Gogh died penniless. Anthony Rubinstein ripped Tchaikovsky's first piano concerto in rage, and Kierkegaard was ridiculed during all his lifetime. At least, and much to our comfort, as history has shown time and time again, genius has always prevailed in the end.